A mí me gustaría mucho introducir y presentar a todos ustedes a Joe Broderick. Quizás muchos de ustedes estuvieron anoche presenciando su Crap Last Tape, su última cinta de Crap, lo cual le agradecemos muchísimo que haya traído esta puesta colombiana acá a México, que no conocíamos. Y bueno, yo voy a presentar tu currículum de manera muy breve porque yo creo que el trabajo de Joe Broderick se presenta solo. Él nació en Melbourne, en Australia, en 1935. Tiene también nacionalidad irlandesa y colombiana. En 2005 publicó su biografía Samuel Beckett, La tragicomedia de la vida. En 2010 adaptó para el teatro el cuento Primer amor de Beckett y luego fue montado en escena bajo la dirección de Manuel Orjuela. En 2011 participó con Primer amor nuevamente en el 6º Festival Beckett en Buenos Aires y en enero de 2014 tuvo 8 funciones de la obra justamente en la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, aquí en la Ciudad de México, y 2 funciones en el Teatro Experimental de Jalisco, en México, por invitación de la Universidad de Guadalajara. Y yo debo decir que ambas instituciones son instituciones en las que trabajo, mi alma mater, ambas, Universidad de Guadalajara y Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, lo cual me da mucho gusto encontrar esta coincidencia. En ambas ciudades, Broderick dictó un taller de 5 días para directores de teatro, actores, estudiantes. Él es escritor, es director de cine, es traductor, es actor, en fin, es una figura creo que fundamental para entender el trabajo de la diseminación de la obra de Beckett en Latinoamérica y por ello pues me da muchísimo gusto poderlo tener aquí entre nosotros con esta conferencia magistral.
Gracias.
Bienvenido, Joe.
Gracias, Luz María. I wasn't sure whether I should give this talk in Spanish or in English. And I decided to write it in English. I thought I'd better be serious about this and put it all down on paper. And I did it in English because we're talking about translating and translating, Beckett translating into English. So there's going to be a lot of English in it in any case. But there'll be a lot of Spanish in it and a bit of French too. So here we go. I took the title, I was inspired to take the title from James and Elizabeth Knowlson's marvelous book, Remembering Beckett, Beckett Remembering. And then only later in Google, I found that there already existed a book with a title very similar to mine, the other way around. It was Beckett Translating Beckett. And then there were so much has been written, as I found, about Beckett as a translator that I realized I'm not going to add very much new, so much for my originality anyway. But I do want to talk about my own, unashamedly, my own efforts at translating Beckett into Colombian Spanish or Latin American Spanish. And that, of course, led me to have a really good look at Beckett as a translator of his own work, and then, of course, as a translator of others, including mainly French, but including also his translation from the Spanish writers, the Spanish poets, which has already been mentioned in this Congress, in this annual get-together of the Beckett Society. So the first piece I tried my hand at was Premier Amour, First Love. I was giving a semester on Beckett every year at Colombia's National University in Bogota in a postgraduate course on creative writing, and I was finding it hard to convince my students that Beckett was fundamentally a comic writer. There was no way they could understand Noel's adage, "Nothing is funnier than unhappiness." "I'll grant you that," she says. Well, they wouldn't grant her that, and found Beckett to be dreary, lugubrious, and pessimistic. And yet I'm convinced that his entire opus can be seen as a series of elaborate constructions designed to illustrate the truth of Noel's statement, namely that the human condition is so pitiful, so smacking of what he calls in Watt purposelessness, I love that word, purposelessness, as to be the funniest thing imaginable. Tears and laughter are all Gaelic to me, he says in one of his characters, meaning that they are incomprehensible because, like life itself, they're a mixture of the two. I love to quote Hugh Kenner's description of Beckett's unique comic repertoire. It's in the first page of Hugh Kenner's extraordinary, very early critical study of Beckett. After trying in vain to convey to my pupils the sense of the ludicrous that never fails to reduce me to tears of laughter whenever I read or reread Molloy, for example, or Malone, I began to suspect that translations were the problem. The ones my students were using had totally failed to communicate the tone of voice of his characters. It appears that the publishing house Tusquets in Barcelona have kind of exclusive rights to translating Beckett. I was told by someone in Curtis Brown that I had no right to translate Beckett. And I said, well, I can translate anyone I wish. I need your permission as the estate of Beckett to perform or publish my translations, but I can sit at home and translate away to my heart's content. Anyway, it's rather unfortunate that Tusquets have that sort of monopoly because, as everyone here, or most people here, know, the Spanish we use, we speak and write, etc., in all of the Latin American countries is pretty different from the way Spanish is spoken and written and so on in the Iberian Peninsula. So I thought I wanted my students to actually be able to hear the voice of Beckett in their own language. And that's why I translated him. I wanted them to hear him because Beckett is to be heard. In that, he's very like Joyce. Every year, for the last 8 years, I've been bringing together groups of people and reading aloud Ulysses of Joyce, and they so enjoy it, hearing it. They found it very difficult to read it, but with my reading, unfortunately, for better or for worse, I do that in Spanish because I have few people who have enough English in my groups to be able to really appreciate Joyce in English. But I read it to them and then they enjoy it. And really, I think the best way to appreciate Beckett is to hear him, as it is the case with Joyce too. And in both cases, to be able to hear them with a Dublin accent in English, because they're both very Dublin writers. So I took First Love because I found, as a starting point, because I found it was a marvelous combination of humor and pathos mixed together. I kept before me both Beckett's original in French and his version in English, which he did not tackle, and only then under duress, when his publishers were insisting on new work, until 1973, almost 30 years after he had written the story. I don't know why Beckett, somebody here might give me a clue on this, why Beckett didn't like Premier Amour, why he omitted it from the publication of his stories. When he published the stories in 1945, he published 3 of the 4 nouvelles, as he called them, and he published the Fin, el expulsado, I'm speaking in Spanish now, with la fin, el expulsé, el calme actif, or whatever it's called. The other three, but he omitted premier amour. I've never understood exactly why, but despite his omitting it and not being satisfied with it, it has become an enormous favorite, especially, I think, amongst actors. It's been done on a stage in I don't know how many languages, for years. So I was looking at his two versions of First Love and noting the fun that Beckett was having as he peppered the English one with humorous nuances not to be found in the original. Some of these proved untranslatable, such as the double entendre contained in the phrase, "I have no bone to pick with graveyards." I love that. I had to stick to what he had in French, "Je n'ai rien contre les cimetières." I have nothing against cemeteries. No tengo nada contra los cementerios. But he had this no bone to pick. And that was my translation of that was rather lame by comparison. But I could get great value out of some others. For instance, in French, after criticizing the verbal structure of the epitaph he has composed for himself, the narrator says, "On me pardonnera plus que cela quand je ne serai plus." This I'll be forgiven more than that when I'm no longer here. But Beckett translates as, "I'll be forgiven more than that when I'm forgotten." And of course, that comic contradiction is not lost on an audience. Of course, the epitaph itself was impossible to do justice to it. Even the French is not as witty as the original, nor could my efforts in Spanish do justice to it. Here underlies the above who up below so hourly died that he lived on till now. That the above who up below is impossible to do it in any other language, I think. I like to refer to an incident when I performed this in Madrid once, quite a few years ago, and in the audience was José Sánchez Sinisterra, a very celebrated dramatist and director, and also the founder in Barcelona almost, I think, more than 30 years ago, of the Beckett Theatre, La Sala Beckett. And he had, in fact, inaugurated that theatre with his own version, his own translation and direction of First Love. So I was very interested to have him in my audience, and he found it difficult, obviously enough, to prescind from his own version, which he had in his mind, and plug in onto mine. But he was particularly taken with the way I translated the very final part of the piece, when the narrator, just about to go off stage, so to speak, to end the story, says, "Ahí está, uno es así, o ama o no ama," which is an almost literal translation from the English. In French, the phrase is rather convoluted. "L'amour, cela ne se commande pas," which would come out something like, "Love is something which does not come on order." If I limited myself to translating solely from the French, I might have come up with "El amor no llega cuando uno quiera," not comparable with the crisp monosyllabic parting shot in Beckett's English language version that I was able to represent in Spanish with the brief, highly charged "o ama o no ama." In performance, that provides the actor, it provided me, with a dramatic exit. But to get back to my students at the postgraduate course, when I read my version to them in class, the effect was hilarious. While my audience appreciated to the full the pathos of Beckett's homeless and loveless narrator sleeping rough on the park bench, the humor of the piece had them in stitches. Their reaction made me realize that First Love is a particularly good instance of that perpetual mixture of laughter and tears, which is Beckett's specialty. There's an aspect of those stories that I was probably unable and really unwilling to even attempt to render in translation, and that is their strange flavor, both in French and English, of something, like old-fashioned. Even in the 1940s, when they were written, they seemed to be set in a bygone era. In The Expelled, for example, L'Expulsé, the character is transported in a horse-drawn carriage, which serves as a taxi cab, and communicates with the coachman by tapping on the roof of the cabin to attract attention. We almost seem to be in the 19th century. And the language reflects this. It's sprinkled as it is with curious circumlocutions, I call them, on the first page of First Love, apropos of noting on a tombstone the date of his father's death, the date of his father's birth, which for some unaccountable reason provides him with his age at the time of his marriage, as he calls it, which is a typical Beckettian non sequitur. It's got nothing to do with the age of his father's, at the age of his death, the time of his death. But he says, je suis en mesure d'affirmer que je devais avoir, etc. I am thus in a position to affirm that I must have been, and so forth. Beckett could have said simply, that's why I can affirm. But no, he prefers to say, he is thus in a position to affirm. And so on throughout these early texts. Even the vocabulary is out of date. As far as I know, people nowadays, apart from medicos, rarely, if ever, refer to human feces as stool. But Beckett does. He does it in Krapp's last tape, as a matter of fact, the iron stool. There are numerous instances of these rather quaint old-fashioned expressions, which are obviously very deliberate on his part to achieve a certain effect. About the translations, the main thing I think is to get the tone right, and I found that by simply translating the words, one could produce something very close to the sound of a world-weary voice. That of a man who, if not old, feels at least prematurely aged, and is, as Krapp says, burning to be gone. And that is one, by the way, is one instance when I certainly couldn't do justice. It comes up in Krapp's last tape when he's sitting alone in the park, drowned in dreams and burning to be gone. It's no way you can do that justice. Fortunately for the translator, he doesn't often lapse into, if that's the word I want, into these beautiful poetic alliterations like that phrase. But mostly, most of his stuff is pretty straightforward. The stories begin with phrases such as, they clothed me and gave me money. Or another one, I don't know when I died. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? The translator can hardly go wrong. The main thing, I believe, is to be as colloquial as possible, since this is the spoken word. It is a literary construct, of course, but one which pretends to imitate real speech. And I wanted my versions to sound both contemporary and Colombian, since they were designed for a Colombian audience. Beckett himself made many minor alterations to his texts, depending on whether they were to be published in an English or an American edition. Likewise, I introduced into First Love, Primer Amor, a number of specifically Colombian usages, such as pendejada, for stupidity. I find it's been used here too, but pendejo y pendejada can be very vulgar words in Chile, for example, as they're not here. And I used mamado for tired in its very colloquial Colombian Spanish. And I think Sam would have smiled, I'm sure he would have smiled when I was able to use the word for smelly feet, which, as far as I know, exists only in Colombia. The rest of the Spanish-speaking world has no specific term for that particular odor. The Colombian one, pecueca, has a perceptible stench in the very sound of it, pecueca. You can smell it, the smelly feet. I couldn't use it, unfortunately, when I was performing in other Hispanic countries. Like Beckett, I had to modify certain terminology depending on local usage. When Lulu tells the character to shove up and make room for her on the bench, the colloquial expression in Colombia is córrase, totally unacceptable in Spain, where correrse refers to the ejaculation of the male sperm. So I had to change that to muévase. Before tackling crap, I took a look at the Spanish language version in the Tusquets edition, and I found there was no way I could use it without sounding odd or even incomprehensible. The Spaniards call the fireplace la lumbre, whereas in Spanish, in Colombia, it's la chimenea. What we call a lámpara, they refer to as el alumbrado, which is something else in Colombia, and so forth. So I did a lot of changes there. I think I spoke last night about crutch. There's no word for crutch. I won't go into that again. I'll skip that paragraph. Beckett found extremely onerous the task of translating his own work, something I can fully appreciate since I've done it myself. Like Beckett, I write in a language which is not my first language, and I sometimes have to translate myself into my first language, and it's an ordeal. When one has constructed an entire literary edifice within the bounds of and enjoying the possibilities of a certain culture expressed in the language of that culture, it is a very taxing experience to have to, so to speak, demolish what you've done, and then build it all up all over again in a totally different world, even if that world is one's own original universe. The undertaking demands perhaps even more from the author when the new creation is to be couched in the idiom of his own mother tongue. For some reason, it makes it harder for it not to sound like a translation. It's a very peculiar thing. When Beckett loathed it, he began by contracting others to do it for him, including a young American writer living in Paris, Richard Seaver. But Beckett, of course, had to take over. But he gave credit, as he was so generous always, he gave credit to Richard Seaver in the translation when it was published. I was tempted to take liberties with my versions of his writing, and I took a cue and some encouragement from Beckett's own freedom when making the leap from French to his native English. One of my favorite examples of what a translator can do is to be found in Endgame. When Clove asks Ham when such a thing happened, quand c'est là, Ham says, oh, c'est loin, tu n'étais pas encore de ce monde. Literally, long ago, you were not yet in this world. Or in Beckett's translation, oh, way back, you weren't in the land of the living. To which Clove replies, la belle époque. Evidently, Beckett, in translation, would not use the phrase la belle époque, although it is used in English, but only to denote that fin de siècle moment of frivolity and boredom prior to the First World War. I think that's where it's mostly used, la belle époque. Yeah, but one would have expected him to say, for example, those were the good old days. It would have been something natural for him to have put as a translation. But no, Beckett was thinking of his audience, and not just as a play. So he's not thinking of his audience, and not just any audience, but an Irish one. So he has Clove reply, God be with the days, which is a typically Irish expression. Nobody in England or Australia or the United States would say naturally, God be with the days. And I think that's wonderful translating. It's saying what would come out of an Irishman's mouth in that situation. This opened a whole new door of freedom for me as a translator. Beckett was telling me not to be literal, but to keep in mind who is listening, if it's a dialogue, as in this case, or reading, when it's a prose text. The important thing, apart from getting the sense right, is to know what will come naturally, trippingly on the tongue, as Hamlet would put it. In this, it seems Beckett was not quite consistent in his old age, when he became very cantankerous and pernickety about anyone altering a single line of his dialogue. He was obdurate and inflexible, except, of course, when the actors were people he liked and admired, and then he would become most condescending. And as I said last night, I know he likes me, and I feel that, and I feel he encourages me, so that gives me a bit of freedom. And I can't resist telling you about a little epiphany I had when Camillo and I, my young director, and I were preparing Crap. We were getting into it for a few weeks, and I was beginning to realize what I'd let myself in for, a tremendous undertaking, which looks simple enough on the page, but it's not simple. And I was sitting reading a book. Now, I have on the wall in my apartment a beautiful portrait painting, a copy of a portrait painting, my friend Gastone Bettelli, an Italian painter living in Bogota. And he has captured something which I've noted in a lot of photographs of Sam Beckett. Even when he looks very severe and stern in his expression, if you look carefully at the corners of his mouth, you often see the beginning of a smile. You know, in most of the photos, a lot of the photos. Well, I was sitting reading a book, and it was a rainy day, and suddenly the sun came through the rain, and a ray of light lit up part of that portrait, just the part around the mouth. And I looked up from my book, and Sam was smiling at me. So that was tremendously encouraging. And I never looked back after that. I took on, with Camillo, I took on the task of doing what the best we could with Crap. Well, I won't go on more about Beckett as a translator of his own work, because I want to speak briefly about him and learn from him as a translator of other writers. The most remarkable of all his translations from French, as far as I can see, is his version of Arthur Rimbaud's Le Bateau Ivre. His versions of surrealist poets like Paul Éluard and Guillaume Apollinaire are more or less literal. Tous ces gens mangent. All these people eat. Ils sont gourmands, ils sont contents. They're gluttons, they are happy. I don't think Beckett or anyone else could do much more with that, without producing a distortion of the original. But to my surprise, in his versions of these poems, Beckett occasionally introduces kind of semi-archaic and slightly effete mannerisms, which seem to have no justification in the original. La simplicité même écrire, for example, is rendered simplicity, yea, even to write. Yea. Yea, I wonder why he says yea, you know. Il faut voir de près, he translates as, it is meet to scrutinize. Well, I like scrutinize for voir de près, but does anyone use meet nowadays? It is meet to scrutinize. I mean, we know the phrase, but it's terribly old-fashioned. Maybe they used it in the 30s. However, he seems to be indulging in that same evocation of former times, which gives this certain old world flavor to those early stories. Now, when he came to sit down and work on his English version of Le Bateau Ivre, the 17-year-old poet genius, he seems to have taken an entirely new tack. Like Rimbaud's boat, he was freed from his moorings, so to speak. It was not a question this time of translating word for word and in the order to which the words came in the original. The challenge here was to convey to the reader the youthful poet's hallucinatory exaltation, his passion, his exuberance, his strangely prophetic sense of foreboding. Right from Beckett's version of the very first quatrain, the reader is launched into deep waters. Downstream on impassive rivers, suddenly I felt the tow line of the boatmen slacken. Redskins had taken them in a scream and stripped them and skewered them to the glaring stakes for targets. It's very powerful. It's interesting to compare this with the translation by the British writer Charles Nicholl. I'm a great fan of Charles Nicholl, and he's got a superb book on Rimbaud in Africa. And he refers to this extraordinary poem, the Bateau Ivre, and translates a bit of it in the book. And his translation of that first quatrain, as I drifted off down the uncharted rivers, it seemed that all of my boatmen were gone. Whooping redskins had taken them for targets, had nailed them naked to painted stakes. That's very literal, carefully literal, and it's good, but it hasn't got anything like the imagination and the power of Beckett. Rimbaud is comme je descendais des fleuves impassibles, je ne me sentis plus guidé par les allures. Des peaux rouges criards les avaient pris pour cible, les avant cloués nus au poteau des couleurs. Both Beckett and Nicholl have taken liberties with the second line, which would be literally, I no longer felt guided by the haulers. But quite different is Nicholl's, it seemed that all of my boatmen had gone. Much more imaginative and at the same time more faithful to the text is Beckett's, I felt the tow line of the boatmen slacken. And we see how the colored stakes, the poteaux de couleur, for Beckett become glaring stakes. And the boatmen are not just naked, nu, as in French and as in the literal Nicholl, but stripped, which connotes a fierce physical action on the part of the redskins. Beckett is doing much more than translating, or I should rather say he's translating in the real, truest sense of the word. He is imagining the lived experience described by the poet, and therefore makes it become alive for the reader. I'll skip a paragraph here because I don't want to go beyond my time, and it probably will. We see Beckett taking even greater liberties, I love this part, when he turned his hand to translating the work of Nicolas de Chamfort, an 18th century poet and playwright with whom he evidently felt a very special affinity. And reading this author's caustic maxims, it's easy to see why. I'll just give a couple of examples. Chamfort, on discovering that the least sensitive people are, the happier they are, he recalls what he refers to as an Indian proverb. Il faut mieux être assis que debout, couché qu'assis, mort que tout cela, which Beckett paraphrases as, better on your ass than on your feet, flat on your back than either, dead than the lot. And for il faut vivre au jour le jour, oublier beaucoup, enfin éponger la vie à mesure qu'elle s'écoule, Beckett provides a rhyming couplet. Live and clean forget from day to day, mop life up as fast as it dribbles away. He was obviously enjoying himself immensely playing with Chamfort's skeptical annotations. Normally, though, translating gave him very little pleasure. Like a lot of serious writers before they made their name, Beckett would frequently be obliged to take on translations as hack work. In the 1930s, when he was still in his 20s, living in Paris, he was usually hard-pressed for cash, and the payment for a translation or two would get him out of a tight spot. In fact, he did the Rimbaud poem for a literary magazine so as to get the price of a fare back to Ireland when his carte de séjour in France ran out and he'd become an illegal immigrant. That was never published in the review of the magazine for which it was composed, and it was lost for decades until somebody found it inside a book somewhere. And Knowlson tells us how Rimbaud, the translation of Rimbaud's poem, was recovered. In the 40s, again, when everything was scarce after the devastation caused by the war in Europe, and his partner and future wife, Suzanne, was earning what she could as a seamstress and giving piano lessons, Beckett was glad to have a contact in UNESCO, which brought him some translating work. It was during his siege in the room period, when he was dedicated to the arduous task of producing the trilogy, but out of necessity, he had to interrupt this to help Suzanne make ends meet. And the biggest and most demanding project that UNESCO offered him was the translation of an anthology of Mexican poetry. The challenge was daunting, given Beckett's all but elementary knowledge of Spanish. According to his biographer, Deirdre Baer, he contacted a Spanish speaker to do what she calls a quick literal translation, which he then proceeded to revise and refine to keep a deadline for UNESCO for the early 1950s, early 1950. When he was reasonably satisfied with what he had done, he sent the whole text to Gerald Brennan, an Irish friend living in Spain who had become fluent in the language. And once again, to quote Deirdre Baer, Brennan was astonished to find only one tiny, insignificant error in the entire manuscript. Then Baer tells us, even though UNESCO had hassled Beckett to keep to their deadline, the translations languished in bureaucratic files until 1958, when the anthology was finally published, cashing in on the fact that by then Beckett had become established as a world-famous author. Another Beckett biographer, Anthony Cronin, quotes from a letter by Beckett to Hugh Kenner in 1960. Quote, "That lousy Mexican anthology was undertaken to take the chill off the pot in the lean winter of 1949-50, and with scant Spanish. It had to be finished by April 1950 for immediate publication. Then, 9 years later, when I thought all danger past and its merits discerned, it comes rattling its doggerel at me." Well, it's worth taking a look at Beckett's doggerel in this amazing volume, which is now something of a collector's item. A very good friend of mine here, a Mexican, very distinguished Mexican poet, found it for me in a second-hand bookshop here in this city. As we know, it was compiled by, the anthology was compiled by Octavio Paz, a very distinguished Mexican poet and essayist, of course, and a future Nobel Prize winner himself, and he included his splendid 20-page introduction to the history of Mexican poetry. But the book is amazing too because of Beckett's translations. Notwithstanding his derogatory remarks about them, they not only remain constantly faithful to the exact sense of the original poems, but they contain occasional passages of high poetical intensity. Unfortunately, the edition is not bilingual, so in order to compare Beckett's versions with the originals, I had to seek out the authors one by one, mostly in Google. The anthology encompasses poetry from the Spanish colonial period in Mexico, the 16th century, right up to the works of López Velarde and Alfonso Reyes in the 20th. My hunt for the poets was richly rewarded. It afforded me a guided tour through the pages of some of the finest writing produced in this country over the period of almost half a millennium. But my special interest, of course, was to see how Beckett had risen to the challenge of finding words for them in modern English. Within the limited space at my disposal here, I'd like to look at just 3 examples taken from different moments in Mexico's history. The anthology begins with a selection of poems on religious themes written by Catholic monks during a period which coincides with the golden age of literature in Spain, namely the late 16th and early 17th centuries, what Octavio Paz calls the high noon of Spanish poetry. The first of these is a sonnet in the Italian Petrarchan mode by Francisco de Terrazas, followed a few pages later by another in the same style, the celebrated No me mueve ni mi Dios para quererte, a very famous sonnet attributed to the Augustinian friar Miguel de Guevara. Let's listen to it in Spanish. No me mueve mi Dios para quererte, el cielo que me tienes prometido, ni me mueve el infierno tan temido para dejar por eso de ofenderte. Tú me mueves, Señor, muéveme el verte clavado en una cruz y encarnecido, muéveme el ver tu cuerpo tan herido, muéveme tus afrentas y tu muerte. Muéveme, en fin, tu amor de tal manera que aunque no hubiera cielo te amara y aunque no hubiera infierno te temiera. No tienes que me dar porque te quiera, porque aunque cuanto espero no esperara, lo mismo que te quiero, te quisiera. Beckett's version in English, though it doesn't attempt to reproduce Guevara's strict rhyming system, it does employ the traditional iambic pentameter of the Elizabethan sonneteers, resulting in a verbal sonority which reflects the music, I think, of the Spanish original. It seems to me Beckett has succeeded in communicating the monk's deep religious sentiment. I am not moved to love thee, my Lord God, by the heaven thou hast promised me. I am not moved by the sore dreaded hell to forbear me from offending thee. I am moved by thee, Lord. I am moved at seeing thee nailed upon the cross and mocked. I am moved by thy body all over wounds. I am moved by thy dishonor and thy death. I am moved last by thy love in such a wise that though there were no heaven, I still should love thee, and though there were no hell, I still should fear thee. I need no gift of thee to make me love thee, for though my present hope were all despair, as now I love thee, I should love thee still. I think that's great. That's great translating. Here Beckett uses the thee and the thou and so on to keep the sense of the times in which the poem was written. He also uses a phrase like in such wise, which is rather old-fashioned English. And then he went on in the anthology, skipping a bit of time, to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. In Paz, Octavio Paz's words, the noblest figure in the colonial period of Spanish poetry. This intellectual cloistered nun wrote numerous sonnets, one of which we'll look at here before rendering Beckett's translation. Detente sombra de mi bien esquivo, imagen del hechizo que más quiero, bella ilusión por quien alegre muero, dulce ficción por quien penosa vivo. Si al imán de tus gracias, atractivo, sirve mi pecho de obediente acero, ¿para qué me enamos lisonjero si has de burlarme luego fugitivo? Mas blasonar no puedes, satisfecho de que triunfa de mí tu tiranía, que aunque dejan burlado el lazo estrecho que tu forma fantástica ceñía, poco importa burlar brazos y pecho si te labra prisión mi fantasía. Let's see how Beckett takes up the challenge of rendering in English a verse so full of intricate metaphors and recondite imagery. He calls it tarry shadow of my scornful treasure, image of my dearest sortilege, fair illusion for which I gladly die, sweet reality for which in pain I live. To the compelling magnet of thy grace, since my breast as docile steel is drawn. Why dost thou with soft ways enamor me, if from me then in mockery thou must fly? And yet thou mayst nowise in triumph boast that over me thy tyranny has prevailed. For though thou breakest, mocking the narrow coil that girdled thy fantastic form about, what boots it to make mock of arms and breast if thou art prisoner of my fantasy? I think that's a great translation. I think the wonderful translation of a couple of lines, si al imán tus gracias atractivo, sirve mi pecho de obediente acero. To the compelling magnet of thy grace, since my breast is docile steel, as docile steel is drawn. Since my breast as docile steel is drawn. That's translating poetry as poetry. To finish off, there's not much time now. I think I've gone behind. Huh? One last poem. I take this one from Lopez Velarde, a brief humorous poem. Ramon Lopez Velarde, with 1888 to 1921. Octavio Paz considers him the first truly Mexican poet. And here's a rather humorous poem. I think Beckett would have enjoyed doing this one, despite the tedious chore that he was given. A mi prima Águeda. Mi madrina invitaba a mi prima Águeda a que pasara el día con nosotros. Y mi prima llegaba con un contradictorio prestigio de almidón y de temible luto ceremonioso. Águeda aparecía resonante de almidón y sus ojos verdes y sus mejillas rubicundas me protegían contra el pavoroso luto. Yo era rapaz y conocía la O por lo redondo, y Águeda, que tejía mansa y perseverante en el sonoro corredor, me causaba calosfríos ignotos. Creo que hasta le debo la costumbre heroicamente insana de hablar solo. A la hora de comer en la penumbra, quieta del refectorio, me iba embelesando un quebradizo sonar intermitente de vajilla y el timbre caricioso de la voz de mi prima. Águeda era luto, pupilas verdes y mejillas rubicundas, un cesto policromo de manzanas y uvas en el ébano de un armario añoso. I love that poem. My cousin Águeda. My godmother invited my cousin Águeda to spend the day with us, and my cousin came with the conflicting prestige of starch and fearful ceremonious weeds. Águeda appeared sonorous with starch, and her green eyes and ruddy cheeks protected me against the fearsome weeds. I was a small boy. Knew O was the round one, and Águeda, knitting, mild and persevering in the echoing gallery, gave me unknown shivers. I think I owe her the heroically morbid habit of soliloquy. At dinner time in the quiet, shadowy dining room, I was spellbound by the brittle, intermittent noise of dishes and the caressing timbre of my cousin's voice. Águeda was, weeds, green pupils, ruddy cheeks, a polychromatic basket of apples and grapes in the ebony of an ancient cupboard. Well, I leave it there. I recommend the book if you're lucky enough to get your hands on it. It's the best overview of Mexican poetry you're probably ever likely to find in one simple collection. Maybe someday it will be published as a bilingual edition, which would be wonderful. So there's still so much more to talk about Beckett as a translator, and I said, as I said, lots of it has already been said by other authors and translators with more authority probably than mine. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Joe Broderick. Y es ideal que estés cerrando esta jornada justamente hablando de la labor de Beckett como traductor de poesía mexicana seleccionada por Octavio Paz, porque también lo mencionó Everett Frost en su conferencia magistral con la cual arrancamos las jornadas. Hoy cerramos volviendo a hacer mención a este episodio y mañana cerramos el congreso justamente con la presencia de Christopher Domínguez Michael, que va específicamente a tratar el tema de Paz y Beckett. Y es una excelente idea pensar en hacer una edición bilingüe para todos aquellos que no han echado mano de ese libro, son muy pocos los que lo tienen, y que se pueda hacer quizás también un estudio al respecto, no nada más poner las dos traducciones. Así que Ricardo García Arteaga, tenemos trabajo por delante. Yo quisiera abrir rápidamente a preguntas, a comentarios. Yo creo que este tema de este Beckett traductor y este traducir a Beckett ha estado presente también a lo largo de este congreso y nos da un pie también a lo que será en España el próximo año el congreso de la Sociedad Samuel Beckett. Entonces, una pregunta por acá.
Thank you. Joe, I would like to ask you about your translation of the short stories by Beckett. In my opinion, this is the only case that I find in which the 4 short stories are published together. As you know, Beckett published The Expelled, The Calmative, and The End first, and then a few years later he published First Love. And the owners of the rights have always respected this pattern. And in Spain, the 2 translations that I know, well, one of them by myself, in fact, I've always, the rights that were given were always like put in this condition first. It had to be, the history of the publications of Beckett had to be respected. So my question is, did you negotiate the rights? Did you talk with anyone in particular? Because this is the only case, as I know, that the 4 short stories, including First Love, First Love has always been published separately. So how was the negotiation? Who did you talk to?
No, I have to confess, I didn't publish it as a commercial publication. I did a little, what you call digital publication to make it available to my students in the first place, and I sold it to them to pay for the copies that I was doing. And then when I started performing First Love in Spanish, I was putting it on sale at the door, tripping people up as they went in or as they went out, and I sold a lot of copies, but wasn't ever in a bookshop. So I didn't really feel, I mean, it was just accompanying the play. It was like a little private thing. So I didn't actually, I must confess, I didn't ask for the rights. I did when I came to perform First Love in public, and I got the rights from Curtis Brown. And when I asked them for the rights for Crap, they've just kept me waiting for the last like 5 years. They haven't actually said no, never said yes. So I kept on doing it. They're sort of in process, I tell people. And very few people in South America even ask you whether you've got the rights sort of thing. I've always been a bit amazed at that. Even when I came to the UAM, I came here with First Love, as Luz Maria was saying, 4 or 5 years ago, and nobody asked me I had the rights. I had them there to show, but nobody asked me. I mean, that's a bit South American style, I think. But I like to get the rights. I think it's the right thing to do. I don't make any real money out of publishing Beckett or performing Beckett. I mean, it's more a work of love. And I couldn't see any reason for holding up my efforts, mine and in this case mine and Camilo's efforts to make Beckett's work known to Colombia and in this case to Mexico and South America, just because they hadn't yet got the definitive reply from the estate. So we've gone ahead, and I know Luz Maria got special permission for this in this case because it wasn't, of course, a commercial performance at all. So, yeah, that's the way I've been going. Now, I have a question for you or for anyone else in the audience. I already mentioned it in my little talk. Can anyone explain to me why Beckett was so dissatisfied with First Love, Premier Amour, from the start? Why he excluded it? Can anyone give me any light on that?
Anybody? Anybody want to?
I try to imagine why.
Answer?
But anyone got any ideas on that? Why?
I think that there's still a kind of realistic story in it, a little bit, even though it has all the euphemism and all the ambiguity that we find in all over Beckett's work. In this particular story, or perhaps it is because I know it very well, in this particular story, there is a story that goes on in a very intelligible way. And perhaps he rejected this realism later on.
But I think that's true of the first two, at least. The end, la fin, as he called it, actually began writing it, as we know, in English with a French title. He called it Sweet, but he was writing it in English. And then he rubbed it all out and started writing it again and called it la fin, at the end. But that tells the story. It tells a very definite story. And the second one does too, the expelled. I don't think that can be really the explanation.
Ebert, would you like to try and answer? No? You? I thought you were saying something. No. Okay.
No.
David?
The person who might well know is Dirk van Hollen, in here at the moment. The manuscript materials might well, and the thing we saw done yesterday, might shed some light on it, but I have nothing to say on the subject, no.
David?
I have a very, very vague memory of reading someplace that I can't remember the exact words now. Publication was delayed until the woman on whom Lulu was based had died. However,
the woman who figures in the story.
Yes, the woman, the real life model for Lulu or Anna had died. However, without the weight of Nolson and Cronin and Dirk van Hoel around here, I wouldn't absolutely swear to it.
Was absolutely?
Gracias.
Yeah, as Everett was saying, we really need Mark Nixon or Dirk van Hoele here. But I also have a memory that there was some personal reason for him delaying the publication, that sometimes that it may have been just a little bit too close.
That some woman would recognize herself.
Possibly.
Maybe, I know.
This may be completely wrong. It's just a memory.
When he published More Pricks Than Kicks, I think he offended a few people, but who recognized themselves in some of the stories, some women especially. So maybe he was uptight about doing that again, taking the risk of doing that again.
Well, I think we may close now. Bueno,
Right.
podemos continuar la conversación ahora que vamos al teatro. Bravo nuevamente, Joe.
Muchas gracias.